I'm ready for it. I'm sick of waiting. I'm sick of not having college football to watch. If you're like me, then you've kind of been watching all of this stuff unfold about the playoffs and the House committee, not the House committee, the House settlement, and it's great because it's entertaining. It's about the sport, but it's just not football. I pay attention to it. I don't always talk about it much because I'd rather, for the most part, let the people in fancy suits who make a lot more money than me take care of it, and they're not listening to what I have to say about it. So why waste too much time whenever I'd rather just talk and dream about the actual sport that we love? But got a couple things to talk about today. I'm gonna start and do some more Florida ceiling talk. We've got a couple SEC teams, got some Big Ten teams, and I'm gonna start with Ohio State for the Florida ceiling. I'm gonna rank coaches based on buyout. I'm also gonna briefly touch on the House settlement because it is a pretty big deal for college football. But let's start with Ohio State. Ohio State. So I've got 9 wins. If I go up and down their schedule, there's 9 games that I feel comfortable writing W next to. And this is all, this is based on projections. We're only in June, which, by the way, June, we're just a little more than a month from SEC Media Days, which is always like my marker of, oh, dang, the season's like we're about to start fall camp, and before you know it, the season's going to be here. So it's getting closer and closer. But, anyways, 9 wins. I've got Grambling, Ohio, Washington, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Purdue, UCLA, and Rutgers. 9 games chalked up as wins, so that sets the floor at 9-3. Now, there's no games that I see that I can just write loss next to, even though Michigan is on the schedule. I don't. It's not just a loss yet or anything, really, for either one of them for the foreseeable future. So 3 toss-ups: Texas, Penn State, and Michigan. So the Texas game is in week 1, obviously. Talked a little bit about that being a big noon kick and the fact that Ohio State wanted to move it, but Texas was fearful of playing a night game and on the road in the Big Ten. So it sucks we won't have a night game there on Sunday for that matchup, but it'll still be a good game. Penn State, big on Penn State this year. They both come off byes, so both teams will be rested and ready. That should be another big time game. And then obviously against Michigan, who we all know the drama and the history with that over the last 4 years. So I'm going to set the ceiling at about 11-1. Still, even though they won a national championship, no one expects them to fall off and, really do anything. If they went 9-3, some people would probably act as if though, they had the same season that Florida State just did and have a meltdown. But overall, wouldn't be a terrible season, especially with that being your floor. So moving on, staying in the Big Ten, but going out west to USC. So big year for Lincoln Riley and that staff. A lot to prove, as coaches. The athletic department, the fans, everyone, they need to see some progress this year under Lincoln Riley and the new defensive staff. They've kind of, hit the reset button a few years in, and it's about time for that to hopefully start paying off. So if I go up and down the schedule, 6 games that I could write W next to: Missouri State, Georgia Southern, Purdue, Michigan State, Northwestern, and UCLA. I've got 5 games that I will put as a toss: Illinois, Michigan, Notre Dame, Nebraska, and Iowa. 1 game is a loss. That's Oregon. So the toss-ups, some of that has to do with, that's just kind of uncertainty around those teams as well as USC. Notre Dame's, they're kind of a bit of a mystery in some respect. There's Michigan there who, that they have kind of, it seems like they have maybe some chaos written on them this year, for better or for worse. In Nebraska, it's about time for Matt Rule there, just like Lincoln Riley, to kind of start showing what he's made of as a coach. So floor is 6-6. For USC, I've got the ceiling at 9-3. Even I think that's probably the best they could do. Probably not good enough to make the conference championship outside of just utter chaos in that conference. Oregon, that's the only only game that really stands out as a loss. And like I said, that's just because even though here lately, I'll be honest, I'm starting to kind of feel some doubt around Oregon this year, but that's a topic for another day. So 6-6 is the floor, ceiling 9-3 for USC. So I'm gonna move on for a brief second, and we're gonna talk about ranking coaches based on buyout. It's always fun to make lists of whatever it is, players, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, coaches. That's one of them. Ranking coaches based on buyout. So that's something that I thought would be fun to go over. Remind everybody how big some of these buyouts are. So I don't remember what the source is. I apologize to where this came from. It was from about a year ago, so it's a touch dated. So, all of these are probably a little bit less, probably a season's worth of salary less. But I'm going to start at number 10 and go all the way up to number 1. So we have a tie at number 10 between Jed Fish and Luke Fickell. So $40.2 million. So that's the buyout for those two coaches. Number 9, we have Mark Stoops at $44.4 million. That's an insane number there at Kentucky. It's probably why he hasn't been fired yet, because they're not going to spend that much money, especially with the House settlement now and revenue sharing, on firing their coach. But he is probably on the hot seat regardless. Steve Sarkisian at Texas at number 8, $55 million is his buyout. Up at Nebraska, we have Matt Rule at number 7, $56.3 million. Touch East, staying in the Big Ten, we have James Franklin at Penn State. His buyout set at $56.7 million. So any of you fans out there in Penn State that want him fired for winning 10 games every year, it's going to cost you about $50 million. So Dabo Swinney at Clemson, $60 million. He's number 5 on the list. Number 4, Brian Kelly, LSU, $61.7 million. It's interesting because Brian Kelly is probably on his season before his hot seat season. So if he doesn't have a good season this year at LSU, if they say go 8-4, even 9-3 with some chaos, kind of like last year, or maybe the year before, where they still won 10 games, but it just felt like almost not a waste of a season, but you had the Heisman winner at quarterback and you couldn't do anything with it. So he's one 8-4 away from being on the hot seat. And so by the time, that season would roll around, he'd probably be in the low 50s, maybe upper 40s. That would be a massive buyout to pay him at LSU. But up at number 3, Mike Norvell at Florida State, $63.8 million. After that conference championship season, they gave him a big raise also to fend off Alabama. So not feeling so good about that right now, but he is number 3 on this list. And number 2, speaking of Alabama, we have Kalen DeBoer, $70 million. They paid a lot of money to get him to come from Washington, so they're probably in there at for the long haul with Kalen DeBoer. Long haul being 3 years, 4 years at Alabama. And number 1, can anyone guess? Still in the SEC. It's Kirby Smart, $118 million. There's no shot that he's getting fired anytime soon. Even if they wanted to, even if he had a couple bad seasons, they would have to move mountains there to shell out that amount of money. He's going to be around at Georgia for the foreseeable future, if anyone didn't guess that already. Not all of our problems are solved. We still have a long way to go in college athletics for, talking about the transfer portal and even with paying players. But the House settlement that was approved over the weekend, it's one of the biggest steps forward, if you want to call it that, in college football that we've seen in quite a long time. It may be a bigger deal than when the Supreme Court initially ruled that players, are entitled to their NIL, kicking off the whole pay-to-play era. But a couple things about the House settlement. This is where schools are allowed to pay their athletes, their players directly. So before as in last week and for the last several years, boosters have formed and fans have formed collectives which then go out and pay players to, play at their school. So NIL, name, image, and likeness, is supposed to be, hey, you're a big name in the sport. Dr. Pepper wants to, they want to have you in their ads. You should be able to be in those ads and be paid for it. It's the reason why we didn't have a college football a college football video game for quite a long time, is because of the whole NIL thing and players, suing over their NIL being used in those games and them not seeing any money for it. So, but that quickly, because of the lack of guardrails and no rules, turned into just pay for play, which it was never supposed to be, but it was pretty obvious to see where that was going to go. So that is supposedly, going to be done away with, and schools will pay players directly. So that'll be essentially their salary. It's going to model more of the NFL, and which seems to be more and more what college football or college sports are doing, is just modeling pro sports. But the entire athletic department, each school is going to have a cap of a $20.5 million to pay their players across all sports. And that's supposed to increase about 4% every year for the next decade. So it's estimated that 13 to 16 million, or 75% more or less of that will go to football players, especially since they account for most of the revenue in the athletic department at pretty much every school. So that'll start July 1st. So that's the revenue sharing that'll come directly from, like I said, the athletic department, and that'll be kind of act as the player's salary. It'll be up to the schools, on how that's distributed. So it's just estimated, like I said, that 70% or so will go to football, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be like that at your school, or, but I would say, places in the SEC, Big Ten, that's probably what it's going to look like. So NIL enforcement. So there's supposedly going to be this NIL enforcement arm called NIL Go. And what that is going to be set up to do is set up to dissect NIL deals that are more than $600 for proper market value. And this is aimed at rooting out the whole pay-to-play deal that we have now, and try and build a more, competitively balanced system. So right now, the collectives, boosters can just pay players. So, and they can say, oh, we want you to sponsor our car wash. Here's, $1 million, and they'll pay the quarterback $1 million or something. But we know that, them throwing up some billboards or whatever, being on some billboards for a business is not worth $1 million. So there's supposedly going to be a system in place that dissects the deals for fair market value that are over, for any deals over $600. And if something is, deemed to be not fair market value, I don't know that it'll recommend or dictate what that value should be, or just say, yes or no. But there's a lot of questions around the legality of that. A lot of lawsuits are probably going to come against the clearinghouse. A, is it legal? B, does it have the authority to void existing deals? That's a question I have, is, any players that are on rosters right now, Texas famously was going to have $30+ million and, going towards their roster, which far exceeds the $20.5 million limit. And that was just for football. So are those deals, supposed to be voided, or is this, going to be grandfathered in? There's a lot of questions in the air about that for this upcoming season. But overall, that's kind of that's what we're looking at. It's a big step, I think, in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to do. There's still going to be a lot of legal challenges, but ultimately, hopefully it'll work out. But at least we're moving, in the direction of guardrails and rules, trying to find a more competitively balanced system, because the NIL pay for play thing was really getting out of hand. That, combined with the 2 transfer portal windows, it was just feeling chaotic. Recruiting's not as fun to follow. So I don't need to get into all that, because I think everyone kind of knows and feels the same there. But hopefully we're taking the right step forward. Circling back around to some Florida ceiling talk, and resume in the Big Ten up at Nebraska. So if I go and look at Nebraska's schedule, there's 7 games that I could write win next to, I think. We've got Cincinnati, Akron, Houston Christian, Michigan State, Maryland, Northwestern, and UCLA. So that obviously puts their floor at 7-5. I've got 3 toss-up games: Minnesota, USC, and Iowa. Iowa is, horrendous on offense, but always has a strong defense and finds ways to win games. Minnesota, I think they're going to be a competitive team and could easily, could bite you that week that you play them. And USC, kind of same thing here. I think they have more talent, but it's just going to kind of depend on how well they've taken a step forward over the offseason. But 2 games that I have written down as a loss, those will obviously be your hardest: Michigan and Penn State. I'd say those are probably 2 solid losses. So because of that, I think you're probably going to get bit somewhere else in the toss-ups, maybe even upset in one of those other games that I thought was going to be a win. So ceiling at 9-3 for Nebraska, floor at 7-5, which I'd say is a pretty damn good season considering you just came off your first bowl season in, was it 10 years, maybe longer? Don't remember. I probably should have looked that up to double check, but wrapping up, moving down to the SEC, the state of Mississippi, we've got Ole Miss. So if I look at your schedule, 8 wins is what I see. Georgia State, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tulane, Washington State, South Carolina, the Citadel, and Mississippi State. I don't see any games that I could easily write a loss next to, but I do see 4 that I could write toss next to, and LSU, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Florida. I think, I wouldn't imagine I'd get too much argument there. You could always probably, you could argue that South Carolina should be in the toss, but I still need to see some consistency out of Shane Beamer at South Carolina. I think they're still a season or 2 away of playing good, consistent football from being, considered a toss-up team for a lot of other, opponents in the SEC. For the 4 tosses, LSU, not super high on them, but they're not going to be an easy out. Georgia, you beat them last year if you're Ole Miss, so they're going to probably take a step back this year, but not going to be an easy out again by any stretch. Oklahoma, I expect them, and Florida for that matter, to take big steps forward, so you're going to have your hands full in those 4 games, and it doesn't get super easy, in the other 8. So I've got your floor at 8-4, I've got your ceiling at 10-2. Probably that's, ceiling, best case scenario. So you're going to be probably right back in the thick of the playoff conversation, especially if, next season, once it probably expands again. But for right now, that's what I've got for Ole Miss. That's what I expect. So thank y'all for listening to this. Make sure to follow me on X, Campus Pigskin. And until then, I'll see you next time on the College Football Podcast.